The history of ancient Egypt spans the period from the early pre-dynastic settlements of the northern Nile Valley to the Roman conquest in 30 BC. The Pharaonic period is dated from around 3200 BC, when Lower and Upper Egypt became a unified state, until the country fell under Macedonian rule in 332 BC. Chronology. Note: for alternative revisions to the chronology of Egypt, see Egyptian chronology. Egypt's history is split into several different periods according to the ruling dynasty of each pharaoh. The dating of events is still a subject of research. The conservative dates are not supported by any reliable absolute date for a span of about 3 millennia. The following is the list according to conventional Egyptian chronology. Pre-dynastic period, proto-dynastic period, early dynastic period, Old Kingdom, first intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period, New Kingdom, third intermediate period, late period, Neolithic Egypt, Neolithic period. The Nile has been the lifeline for Egyptian culture since nomadic hunter-gatherers began living along it during the Pleistocene. Traces of these early people appear in the form of artifacts and rock carvings along the terraces of the Nile and in the oases. To the Egyptians, the Nile meant life and the desert meant death, though the desert did provide him protection from invaders. Along the Nile, in the 12th millennium BC, a grain-grinding culture using the earliest type of sickle blades had replaced the culture of hunters, fishers, and gathering people using stone tools. Evidence also indicates human habitation and cattle herding in the southwestern corner of Egypt, near the Sudan border, before 8000 BC. But according to Barbara Barrett, the idea of an independent bovine domestication event in Africa must be abandoned because subsequent evidence, gathered over a period of 30 years, has failed to corroborate this. In light of this, the oldest known domesticated bovine remains in Africa are from the Fayum Sea, 4400 BC. Geological evidence and computer climate modeling studies suggest that natural climate changes around 8000 BC began to desiccate the extensive, pastoral lands of northern Africa, eventually forming the Sahara. Continued desiccation forced the early ancestors of the Egyptians to settle around the Nile more permanently and forced him to adopt a more sedentary lifestyle. However, the period from 9000 to 6000 BC has left very little in the way of archaeological evidence. Pre-dynastic period. The Nile Valley of Egypt was basically uninhabitable until the work of clearing and irrigating the land along the banks of the river was started. However, it appears that this clearance and irrigation was largely underway by about 6000 BC. By that time, society in the Nile Valley was already engaged in organized agriculture and the construction of large buildings in the Nile Valley. At this time, Egyptians in the southwestern corner of Egypt were herding cattle and also constructing large buildings. Mortar was in use by 4000 BC. The people of the Nile Valley and on Delta were self-sufficient and were raising barley and emmer and stored it in pits lined with red mats. They raised cattle, goats and pigs, and they wove linens and baskets. The pre-dynastic period continues through this time, variously held to begin with the Naqada culture. Between 5500 and 3100 BC, during Egypt's pre-dynastic period, small settlements flourished along the Nile, whose delta empties into the Mediterranean Sea. By 3300 BC, just before the first Egyptian dynasty, Egypt was divided into two kingdoms, known as Upper Egypt, Tashima, to the south, and Lower Egypt, Tamihu, to the north. The dividing line was drawn roughly in the area of modern Cairo. The Tajan culture was the next to appear in Upper Egypt. This group is named for the burials found at Der Tassa, a site on the east bank of the Nile between Asiyut and Akhmim. The Tajan culture group is notable for producing the earliest blacktop ware, a type of red and brown pottery painted black on its top and interior. The Badarian culture, named for the Badari site near Der Tassa, followed the Tajan culture. However, similarities between the two have led many to avoid differentiating between them at all. The Badarian culture continued to produce the kind of pottery called blacktop ware, and was assigned the sequence dating numbers between 21 and 29. The significant difference, however, between the Tajan and Badarian culture groups, which prevents scholars from completely merging the two, is that Badarian sites use copper in addition to stone, and thus are Chalcolithic settlements, while the Tajan sites are still Neolithic, and are considered technically part of the Stone Age. The Amratian culture is named after the site of El Amra, about 120 kilometers south of Badari. El Amra was the first site where this culture group was found unmingled with the later Gurzian culture group. However, this period is better attested at the Nakada site, and so is also referred to as the Nakada the first culture. Black-topped ware continued to be produced, but white cross-line ware, a type of pottery decorated with close parallel white lines crossed by another set of close parallel white lines, began to be produced during this time. The Amratian period falls between SD 30 and 39 in Pratri's sequence dating system. Trade between Upper and Lower Egypt was attested at this time, as newly excavated objects indicate. A stone vase from the north was found at El Amra, and copper, which is not present in Egypt, was apparently imported from the Sinai, or perhaps from Nubia. Obsidian and an extremely small amount of gold were both definitively imported from Nubia during this time. Trade with the oases was also likely. The Gurzian culture, named after the site of Gertsa, was the next stage in Egyptian cultural development, and it was during this time that the foundation for dynastic Egypt was laid. Gurzian culture was largely an unbroken development out of Amratian culture, starting in the delta and moving south through Upper Egypt. However, it failed to dislodge Amratian culture in Nubia. Gurzian culture coincided with a significant drop in rainfall, and farming produced the vast majority of food. With increased food supplies, the populace adopted a much more sedentary lifestyle, and the larger settlements grew to cities of about 5,000 residents. It was in this time that the city dwellers started using mud brick to build their cities. Copper instead of stone was increasingly used to make tools and weaponry. Silver, gold, lapis, and faience were used ornamentally, and the grinding palettes used for eye paint since the Badarian period began to be adorned with relief carvings.